Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 18 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Just a quick note, it's raining hard here in Geektown today, aka Springfield, Oregon, where I record the show. I'll try my best to reduce that noise, but it may still sneak in. This week, we're taking a break from answering listener questions. We'll be right back to that next episode, so please send any new questions you have in. Instead, I wanted to take this opportunity to pay tribute to a man we lost recently, Stan Lee. While he's most well known these days from his cameos in the Marvel movies, for me growing up in the 80s, I'll always remember him as the voice of the narrator opening and closing each episode of the Incredible Hulk cartoons. But of course, he was more than that famous face and voice. Let's go through some of his history together and talk about a few of the things that made him so important to the comic book industry and its fans. Born in 1922 to Romanian-born immigrants, Stanley Lieber grew up during the Depression in various parts of New York City. He always enjoyed writing and imagined himself one day writing the great American novel, and was recognized for his skills as a teen, winning high school essay competitions. He graduated early at 16 and a half, and at 17 began what would become the career which would last the rest of his long life. With his uncle as a connection, Stanley got an assistant job at Timely, later to be known as Marvel, Comics, starting with simple tasks like fetching lunch, keeping the inkwells filled, yes, back then they used hand-dipped ink pens, and proofreading. But with his foot now in the door, he was able to start writing. His debut work was a short text story published in the back of Captain America Comics number 3. And it was here that he introduced his pen name, splitting his first name in two to become Stan Lee. At the time, he didn't want his real name associated with comic book work, because he still had that dream of becoming a novelist. However, fate had other plans. Stan continued to write for the comics, creating World War II-era heroes like Jack Frost, Father Time, and others. Late in 1941, when Stan's first boss, Joe Simon, left Timely Comics, publisher Martin Goodman promoted Stan to interim editor. Stan was just 19 years old at this point. This worked out so well that Stan stayed as the editor-in-chief of the comics division until 1972, when he succeeded Martin Goodman as publisher. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Like many young men at the time, Stan joined the Army in 1942, working first in the Signal Corps and then the Training Film Division, and was in until 1945. He was temporarily replaced as editor during this time, but continued writing stories, receiving and fulfilling his assignments through mail. With the golden age of superheroes ending, Stan wrote stories in various genres, including westerns, romance comics, sci-fi, horror, and humor. By the late 1950s, Stan was tiring of this job and was thinking about quitting comics altogether. When publisher Martin Goodman approached Stan to create a new superhero team to compete with crosstown rival DC's Justice League, Stan had pretty much decided this was the last comic he would be making. However, his wife Joan suggested that since he was quitting anyways, why not write the kind of story he wanted to? Instead of the perfect people that were usually the heroes of these kinds of tales, Stan wrote about a squabbling family that had flaws and internal disagreements, but still ended up doing the right thing in the end. You may remember me bringing this story up in episode 6, as this comic ended up being Fantastic Four #1, the birth of what was to be known as the Marvel Universe. With his creative flame rekindled, Stan, working mostly with artists Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, created a bevy of heroes over the next few years, many of whom have become household names, including Spider-Man, the Hulk, the original X-Men, Iron Man, Thor, Doctor Strange, Daredevil, and Nick Fury, just to name a few. Here's where we run into a bit of controversy related to Stan Lee's history. How much is Stan Lee responsible for the creation of these characters, and how many of their stories did he write? In order to keep up the output demanded by both the audience and the publisher, a new method of collaboration was created by Stan, which is now popularly known as the Marvel Method. Up until this point, comic scripts were written primarily as full scripts first, then handed to a penciler who would follow the panel-by-panel descriptions given in those scripts. Stan, however, gave his pencilers basic plot descriptions, letting the artists dictate more of the pacing of the story and other details. He would then return to them as finished pages and create dialogue fitting the story as he saw it. Some say his input was even lesser than what I just described above, basically adding his name to stories that were created nearly whole cloth by the artists. I wasn't there, so I can't say one way or another, but as this is intended as a tribute, I'll leave that discussion for now for comic historians to hash out in another venue. But I would like to point out that many of those artists went on to write stories of their own, and they're not the same as those that have Stan's pen to them. Whether or not the artists deserve more credit, the fact that they got any at all was in large part due to Stan. One of the big changes that Stan as editor-in-chief made was to make the various creators' presences known, with splashy title pages that included the credits for writer, penciler, inker, letterer, and colorist. Many comics from the 40s and 50s were not 100% sure who wrote or drew them, as no one kept track of those things, and the people who could have told us were gone by the time people thought to ask. But now, readers could see who it was that drew these comics, and follow artists as they moved from book to book. And Stan gave everyone nicknames like Jack King Kirby, Jazzy John Romita, and Dazzling Don Heck. As for Stan himself, he was simply Stan the Man Lee. With these nicknames, and Stan's monthly writing in Stan's Soapbox, which appeared in every Marvel comic, the reading audience got to know more about the people behind the scenes of their favorite books. With their names now public, this was the first step towards writers and artists getting the true credit for their work, leading to more creators' rights in the industry. Throughout the 1960s, Stan wrote about the issues of the day, both in his stories and his editorials. In Amazing Spider-Man, things like the Vietnam War, student activism, and racial inequality were brought up. Stan also worked to create a more diverse cast in his books, introducing Robbie Robertson as the Daily Bugle's editor-in-chief, one of the first African American supporting characters in comics to not be used as comic relief. In the Fantastic Four, the Black Panther was introduced, who was the first mainstream black superhero. And in 1969, over in Captain America, Stan and artist Gene Colan gave us the first African American superhero with Sam Wilson, aka the Falcon. You can hear more on his history in episode 7. Obviously, we still have a long ways to go in terms of racial equality, both in the comics and real life, but all progress should be celebrated. Perhaps Stan's best-known story involving more serious subject matter was Amazing Spider-Man 96 through 98, written in 1971, in which Peter Parker's best friend and roommate, Harry Osborn, became addicted to prescription pills. The history of the Comics Code Authority is something that could make up its own separate episode, but to sum up, this self-censoring group would put its stamp on any story that stayed within its guidelines. At the time, that included no depictions of drug use, even if portrayed in a negative light. Stan, however, felt the story was too important not to publish, especially as he had been asked to write such a tale by the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And so, the books went out without the Comics Code Authority shield, the first books by any major publisher to do so since the code's creation. The comics won praise for their raising awareness of the issue, and subsequently, the CCA changed the code to allow negative depictions of drug use, allowing future stories to go even further, such as the famous Green Arrow, Green Lantern tale by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. As I mentioned earlier, it was in 1972 that Stan assumed the role as publisher at Marvel Comics. At this point, he ceased writing the monthly books that were coming out, ending his runs on Amazing Spider-Man and Fantastic Four at issues 110 and 125, respectively. He still wrote special issues, such as Marvel's first original graphic novel, The Silver Surfer: The Ultimate Cosmic Experience, with artist Jack Kirby. And he created the Spider-Man newspaper strip, which he wrote for many years. But at this point, his focus was more towards Hollywood. In 1981, he moved out to California and was the public face for Marvel Comics, working on getting his creations translated to movies and television. It was here that his penchant for cameos began. His very first screen appearance was as the jury foreman in 1989's Trial of the Incredible Hulk TV movie, starring Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. Since then, he has appeared in almost every single movie based on a Marvel character, even characters he had no part in creating, like Deadpool. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he's been shown to be working for the Watchers, a race of powerful beings who observe the important events of the universe without interfering. A race of beings he created in arguably his most celebrated story, Fantastic Four 48 through 50, titled The Coming of Galactus. Perhaps my favorite Stan Lee cameo is in Spider-Man 3, standing next to Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, when he says,
"You know, I guess one person can make a difference." Enough said.
That would be a good ending, but there's one last quote I'd like to leave on, and it explains the motto Stan used to sign off each of his editorial pages, as well as each episode of the Incredible Hulk cartoons that I remember him from as a kid. He said, quote, "You know, my motto is Excelsior. That's an old word that means upward and onward to greater glory. It's on the seal of the state of New York. Keep moving forward, and if it's time to go, it's time. Nothing lasts forever." End quote. Thanks, Stan. Excelsior. Finally, before we go, I want to remind you all that this podcast is powered by you and your questions. So please let me know what you want to learn about next by sending an email to me at welcometogeektown@gmail.com or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council and help other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.